Good morning, everyone. Now we're going to talk a little bit about one of my great passions in life, storytelling. And in that spirit, I would like all of you to indulge me for a second. So if you would all please close your eyes. Take a deep breath. If I would ask you to come up here with me on this stage and tell a story about the most significant event of your life, which story would you choose to tell? Take a minute to think about that. Okay, you can open your eyes. Now, I don't know what you all thought about, but it can be really difficult to identify the significant events of one's own life. There are, of course, some important events that we all recognize, like, for instance, moving away from home, or choosing your career path, having a baby. Also, less enjoyable but still important events like death of a loved one, or maybe life-altering sickness. But what about the smaller, more everyday type of events? The things that happen all the time in our life, that change us in smaller or bigger ways, sometimes even without us noticing them. Those are the kinds of stories that I'm mainly interested in. My background is as a medical doctor, which has given me the opportunity to speak to a lot of people, often during these life-altering periods of sickness. And a big part of that job is listening to people's stories and try to figure out how to help them where they are right now. But in addition to that, I also work as a story producer for live storytelling shows in my hometown in Oslo, Norway. And that means that I regularly invite people to go up on a stage and share very, very intimate details about themselves to a crowd of strangers who expect to be entertained. And I do this because I love stories and I love personal storytelling. And the reason for this is primarily that life is very, very funny. But life can also be sad, and it can be aggravating and confusing, and it can be very, very beautiful. And these are qualities that make for great stories and great entertainment. I also do this because I believe that stories have the ability to create change and development in us as human beings. And I think we've seen that very recently with the Me Too campaign, where women all over the world used their personal stories under the hashtag #MeToo to tell about sexual harassment. And together they created a systematic picture that was very difficult to ignore. I also believe that in this world, where a lot of the human stories that we experience are filtered through a gloss of social media, we really need alternate platforms to tell about our lives to each other. So today I would like to focus a bit on personal storytelling and how we as human beings can use the way we speak about our own lives to change how we see ourselves. And to kick things off, I would like to give you an example. One of the storytelling shows I work with is called Mortified. And in this show, we invite people to go on stage and tell stories about their teenage years. And we want them to do this by reading aloud from diaries and other things they wrote when they were young. And this is really, really funny, because teenagers can be exceptionally clueless when they're trying to figure out how to do everything in life for the first time. But it can also be really angst-provoking to tell these kinds of stories, something that I got to experience personally the first time I shared a story on stage. Because the story about my teenage years is not a very happy one. I was a huge nerd with a very, very intense love for Lord of the Rings. And where I grew up, I had a really hard time making friends. And I experienced a lot of rejection, both from my peers, but also from adults that I was surrounded by. And this made me very sad, and I spent a lot of time being lonely and even depressed. And when I was going to revisit that story, those same feelings came back. And it made me feel very uncomfortable to think about going on stage and present myself as some kind of lonely and depressed person, because that's not at all how I see myself today. And it brought a lot of feelings of shame and also pity for my past self. But as I sat down with another story producer and started working on my material, a very, very different narrative started emerging. Because as I read my own diaries and my emails and letters that I wrote, I realized that 13-year-old me, yes, she was sad, yes, she was lonely, but she didn't really accept that situation. She went out and she looked for solutions. She tried to find different social circles. She joined an NGO and started volunteering. And she looked for different places to make friends. And I'd never thought about my own narrative like that before. It was a completely new realization that I took agency and tried to change my life. And as I continued working with other people's stories, I also discovered that this happened for them as well. And this kind of woke the scientist and the researcher in me, because I thought about stories as something you tell to an audience and you're trying to move them. But my experience also told me that the stories I tell can have an effect on me as a storyteller. And as I dove a bit deeper into this material, I discovered that in personality psychology there's a thing called narrative identity. And narrative identity is the idea that we as human beings tell a continuous story, an internalized story about our lives, with ourselves as the protagonist. And this story is a retrospective understanding of our past, it's an ongoing understanding of our present, but it's also an imagined direction of our future. And the core idea of this is that we use story to create order and meaning in a sometimes very chaotic world where life throws all kinds of random things at you. And this story gives us purpose. When researchers have looked at narrative identity, there is one thing that is really clear, and that is that you can really learn a lot about a person from how they speak about themselves. And not only how they're doing right now, but also how they might be doing long term. Because there seems to be a really close connection between the words we use when we speak about our lives and our long-term mental well-being. And there are especially three things that seem to be important. Firstly, agency. How much control do you give yourself over the events that happen in your life? And not only control to decide what happens, but also control over how you react to things that happen to you. The second thing that seemed to be important was your degree of connectivity. That is how much you feel connected to other people around you instead of a feeling of isolation. And the third thing that seemed to be important is your ability to designate meaning to things that happen, and especially meaning to negative things that happen in your long-term narrative. And these things actually seem to be much more important than a lot of other indicators of how you'll do long-term, like what you're working with, or how much money you make, or your personality traits. And that is really cool, because it can be very difficult to change a lot of your circumstances in life, but the way you tell stories about yourself is something that's definitely under your control. And when I discovered this, I started thinking about some of the things I learned back in med school about how the human brain works, and especially how human memory works. Because a lot of people think about memory as some kind of filing cabinet that is stored in a memory center in your brain, and you experience something and it's written down in a file, and then the file is put into that cabinet, and then you remember it and you take the file back out and you read it like some kind of photocopy. But that's not at all how human memory works. Because human memory is a very complex process of cognitive and sensory and emotional input, and it happens all over your brain in many different centers. A very cool Norwegian neurologist called Kaja Nordengen even went as far as calling the recollection of memory a creative process in the brain. I think it's much more useful to think about memory like this. Your memory of a certain event is like a skeleton or a grid, where you've stored some important key aspects of what happened, but you need to fill in the gaps. And when you remember something, your brain fills in those gaps, but it does that right now in the present, which means that your memory will be influenced by your present emotional state. And if you then move on to enforce that memory, for instance by putting words to it or telling a story about it, it will be even more enforced in the present. And then when you store that memory, it will look different than it did when you began. So what's my point here? If we go back to the story about my teenage years, I think it illustrates very well how this process works. Because if you think about it, I changed my narrative. I changed my narrative from one of sadness and hopelessness into one of agency and control over the situation I was in. I increased my degree of connectivity with other people when I presented my story on stage, because the people who were watching, they laughed at the funny parts, but they also listened very attentively to the more emotional parts, and they recognized my emotions. Thirdly, I began recognizing myself in my story. And now, when I think about that memory, it has much more meaning in my long-term narrative as a formative part of the puzzle who created who I am today. And when I think about it now, it looks completely different than when I began. So, what can we all learn from this? I think that we could all use a little bit more storytelling in our lives. Because that if we know that human beings use stories to create meaning, and we also know that the way we tell those stories impact how we do over time, I think we can use that. We can use that as a power tool to change how we see ourselves and our self-perception. And you don't have to do this by going on stage and sharing a story. This is something you can do in your everyday life when you're talking to your friends or your family, by paying a little bit more attention to your own narrative. And I believe this is very important, because we live in a world where it's very easy to feel insignificant. It's very easy to get lost. And we're constantly bombarded with standards that seem impossible to live up to. And by reclaiming our narrative, I think that we can challenge those standards. And by telling our stories about ourselves like we matter, we can really perform a great act of everyday subversion. Thank you.